to the Home Affairs Select Committee one-off session on the policing of the coronation, and specifically we want to look today at the provisions in the Public Order Act 2023 which were used on the day. Can I also just welcome the Chair of the Joint Committee on Human Rights, who's guesting with us today, Joanna Cherry. To start off with, we recognise on the committee the huge challenge that the coronation presented. Golden Orb was one of the largest operations in the history of the Met, and I think it is to their credit that they kept everybody safe and without major incidents. However, we do have a series of questions about the policing of protests at the coronation. We've got the two panels this morning. The first panel with the Metropolitan Police and the National Police Chiefs Council representative, and then in the second panel we're going to hear from those who were arrested and detained, plus a lawyer with extensive experience in the area. So could I just ask our first panel to introduce themselves? Would you like to start?
Good morning, Chair. Thank you. My name is Matt Twist. I'm the Assistant Commissioner for Met Operations.
Good morning, Chair. Chris Noble, Chief Constable of Staffordshire Police, but for the purposes of this hearing at least, I'm also the National Policing Lead around the policing of protest.
Thank you very much. Now, we are quite short on time, and we've got quite a lot of members who want to ask questions. So if you could be brief in your answers, that would be helpful. And if I could just implore members of the committee to be fairly succinct as well in their questioning, that would be good. Can I just start with the first question, which is, did the Metropolitan Police feel under any political pressure to police the coronation in a certain way?
No.
No. Okay, not at all.
So I think, as is the case with any policing operation, the first thing to say is that we would rigorously guard our operational independence, which is critically important. And we police the laws as they are set without fear or favour, and that has always been the case. And what is clear in the case of protest is that there are strongly held and differing views in public, on social media and across politics, actually, as to what is right and what isn't right. So our objective is very much to police the laws as they are set without fear or favour. And I was grateful to you, Chair, at the start for highlighting just how enormous the operation was. The coronation of His Majesty King Charles and Queen Camilla was a historic moment of huge national significance, and we're proud to have successfully ensured it was delivered safely and in a secure way, despite the most challenging, fast-moving and complex policing picture we've ever encountered for a national celebration.
Right, thank you. Can I just ask you then, were you surprised that the Home Office Police Powers Unit wrote to organisations like Republic on the 27th of April, setting out the new provisions within the Public Order Act which were due to come into force? Were you surprised by that?
That wasn't something I was familiar with at the time, but I think Chris might have some knowledge of the letter. I don't think it's completely unusual.
It's happened before, in other cases then?
Yeah, Chair, just to help again, we weren't aware of it from a policing point of view, so that the detail, the motive ultimately is one for Home Office and Home Office officials to speak to, but the PCSC Act, again, primarily because of the compressed time between royal assent and commencement, my understanding is that letters were sent out previously for that previous piece of legislation.
Sorry, on that piece of legislation they were sent out previously, you're saying?
On the PCSC Act, again, I think there was maybe between royal assent and commencement, maybe 14 days for one element of that legislation to come into place. Right. So I believe letters were sent out because of that compressed timescale. I think that's been replicated in this occasion for the Public Order Act.
Right. There was a view that those letters could be seen as intimidatory.
So, as I said, I'm not familiar with the letters, and I think that that's something that would have to be addressed to the Home Office.
Right. When I asked the Minister about it, he kind of said, well, he hadn't signed the letter. He didn't seem to know very much about it either.
So, on that point, I can't help any further, I'm afraid.
OK, I'm going to come to Joanna Cherry now.
Thank you, Chair. Just quickly, can I ask you, Assistant Commissioner Twist, why do you think it was reported in the newspapers that a senior Met source said that political pressure had come from above?
So, honestly, I have no idea, in that I can't comment on anonymous sources that were reported in the newspapers without any detail. From my point of view, I felt under no pressure politically. I felt pressure to deliver a safe and secure operation, but that was because of the fact it was a once-in-a-lifetime event for so many people, and there would be hundreds of thousands of people in London to celebrate it. And also, and importantly, this was the biggest protection operation we have ever run. There were 312 protected people that we managed to get in and out of the Abbey and across the footprint in about 90 minutes. So the stakes were enormously high, so I absolutely felt pressure to deliver a safe and secure operation. But that wasn't political pressure, that was the pressure to do a good job.
Did you also take into account the fact that the police have a duty under Section 6 of the Human Rights Act to facilitate protest?
Of course. So, and I have seen reporting which is completely erroneous and false that suggests that all protest was prohibited or banned or in some way constrained. That simply isn't the case. We're very familiar with our duties around dealing with protest, both positive duties under the Human Rights Act and negative duties. And balancing the rights of people who wish to protest with those impacted by the protest is part of the day-to-day job of policing in London. I think it's fair to say that just in the last 12 months we've dealt with something like 4,000 events, 500 of them are protest-specific. And it's a point that's worth noting as well, since the legislation that we're talking about was enacted and royal assent was given, there's been 67 protest events in London. The only time the new legislation has been used was the one-off occasion we're talking about here today.
You talked there about the balance, getting the balance right. You'll be aware that the European Convention on Human Rights provides that protests can be limited in order to protect the rights of others, but any restriction of that right is only lawful if it's both proportionate and necessary under Article 10 and Article 11. So do you accept that when it comes to the balance, the scales are actually weighed in favour of protecting the right to protest rather than equally balanced? And that was the conclusion of my committee when we looked at Part 3 of the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, which of course was the precursor of the Public Order Act.
So, of course, we're really familiar with that, and part of the complexity of this area of law is that there are a number of both primary and secondary sort of legal instruments that play. There's the Human Rights Act, and then there's case law, and all of the time the law is being interpreted by the courts, and most recently in the Supreme Court case in Ziegler, which set out the conditions that we might need to consider as part of this. But you're absolutely right, of course. The Articles 9, 10 and 11 of the European Convention do form the basis of an individual's right to participate in peaceful protest, and we fully respect that. But it's also, as you've said, and I agree with, this is a qualified right, and we are continually balancing the rights of those who seek to protest with those who are impacted by it. And what we have seen latterly is where there's a sort of fine line between what is peaceful protest and then what is straying into illegal activity, as we've seen in the sort of latter part of last year and the start of this year, and where the shifting of those scales sort of takes place, where crime is being committed, then obviously we need to intervene much more quickly.
Can I put it to you that the language of balancing, which is used frequently by police officers and policing bodies, is not always helpful, because if you view protest as inherently problematic and inconvenient rather than as a necessary and important element of a free society, balance will almost always fall on the side of maintaining order and preventing crime, whereas the starting position should always be that peaceful protests should not be restricted and should be facilitated so far as possible.
And I agree with that, and the evidence, I believe, would show that that's what we do. Getting the balance right between the qualified rights of protesters and the impact is difficult, and protest is by its nature designed to get attention. We understand that. But I'm very clear that there is a strong presumption in favour of the right to protest, and that's important in a democratic society. But where that strays into crime, then obviously the police will deal with the laws as we find them. But this is something we are very familiar with, and we understand the sort of human rights position.
Constable Noble, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, just a couple of points. I think there might be some debate amongst Articles 8, 9, 10 and 11 where a hierarchy exists, and clearly from a policing point of view, Articles 2 and 3 are pretty fundamental. So very often in a public order event where protests are involved, there can be matters of public safety come to the fore, which clearly then need to be effectively dealt with. But just to support Matt, policing is not anti-protest. We've got positive and negative obligations under human rights legislation. My experience in a different jurisdiction is actually fundamentally, it is a good thing for society in terms of being able to protest in a peaceful but also a reasonable way. And I think a lot of the things that we will probably discuss today or have debates about are where that tipping point is reached, whether we like to call it a balance or not, because that's the language of the courts. Where that tipping point is reached in terms of when it becomes unreasonable, and then policing, without any great desire to do so, has to intervene and ultimately allocate resource that they would much rather allocate in other parts of the policing environment. So there is no presumption against protest. It's actually quite the opposite.
Can you tell us, do all police officers receive ongoing training on their human rights obligations?
So in terms of the sort of training environment for policing, there's an initial input and initial training in terms of human rights obligations. There's a model around decision-making in policing called the National Decision-Making Model, which has at its core key tests around human rights obligations. That will be reinforced on an ongoing basis whenever new legislation is introduced. Whenever we move into the world of public order and public safety, there are really quite strict initial courses to be attended. There's reaccreditation, there's quarterly CPD for the most senior commanders, there's regular CPD for more junior and specialist commanders, and then there will be access both pre, during and post-event to specialist lawyers, again around human rights obligations, to test the policing operation before, during and after, and then clearly and appropriately significant scrutiny, whether it be from committees like this, IOPC, police and crime commissioners, and indeed other bodies who have a real interest in protest as well.
Thank you.
Simon Fell.
Thank you, Chair. Chief Constable, I just wonder whether you could take us through how police forces across the country prepare when a new act like the Public Order Act is brought in.
In terms of the preparation for that new legislation landing, it can be challenging. We've had sort of moving parts recently in terms of legislation, but to be very transparent from a policing point of view, our ask of the Home Office was give us current legislation, give us legislation which is fit for the challenges that we're facing today, and that is capable of being enforced. So a significant amount of the changes in legislation, whilst policing doesn't set the law, it's made it very clear where they have identified some gaps or some challenges, but ultimately the making of the law is a matter for Parliament, as is the timing of that law actually commencing. So on this occasion, I think royal assent was granted on the 2nd of May at about 2:30 in the afternoon, commenced at midnight technically on the 3rd of May. Within 10 hours then we had briefing documents across the country to chief constables, to our gold commanders, which are our most senior public order commanders, and that was cascaded down as well. And Matt might want to speak about how that happened within London, but putting that information in officers' hands. What we couldn't do was preempt exactly what would come out of the legislation. We weren't going to do anybody's job for them. We didn't want to put a version out in advance which would have to be amended. So whilst timing was compressed, we'd had discussions in advance about how we would do that and get the information into the hands of people who need it.
So, and from a London perspective, of course, we got the correspondence from the MPCC and the college guidance at the time shown. This was circulated to all public order commanders within the Met at all levels, as well as our public order training staff and our tactical advisors on the same day. There was a specific briefing by the Silver Commander and one of our most experienced officers from the Strategic Training Unit who trains public order officers for the command team who were taking place in Operation Golden Orb. And some of the bronzes within that command team then placed constraints on the use of that legislation, that it would only be used if they were notified and consulted in advance. So whilst it was short notice between the operation and the timing of it is a matter for Parliament, we believe we were in good shape in terms of the briefing and officers knew what they had to do.
Thank you. And so in the case of Golden Orb, we know, and we'll be hearing from some of the other witnesses later on this, but you've been in communication with some of the protest groups who are planning to attend. Obviously this is something new for you to understand how to implement this legislation, how to use it appropriately. It's also something new for them. Could you take us through some of the detail in those communications and in that dialogue. So what would that look like? If they have questions, do they come back to you? Do you just point them at the bill?
So I think in the broader sense, it always works best when groups that are looking to protest engage with the police. And this is something that's been going on now for many years, where we have a protest liaison team, gateway team, and people that want to conduct large protests in London will make contact with that team. And that is not for us in any way to constrain what they want to do, but we can provide advice, we can provide, be clear on what the responsibilities of organisers might be. And this is a tried and tested process for many, many protest groups now that will engage with our gateway team, who will then get notified about what they want to do. And what that helps with is it helps us provide a proportionate policing response, which at times may be nothing at all, depending on what the matters are in hand. There are some groups who don't engage at all, which makes things much more challenging, both in resourcing terms and in terms of what their intentions are and where they might go. So groups like Animal Rebellion or Just Stop Oil do not engage, despite repeated attempts for us to do that. Therefore, which means it leads to greater abstractions from local policing, frankly, as we have to continually manage an unknown sort of risk. In terms of this case, if we're talking about the Republic protest, Not My King, then they did engage with the protest liaison teams in advance via multiple means in terms of letters earlier in the year, and then there was further correspondence in the run-up. I don't know whether there was specific engagement on the point of the new legislation.
Because I suppose that's what I'm trying to get to, because at the nub of this, and I know some of my colleagues will pick up on this later, but there were straps used to hold placards together which were interpreted as potentially being potentially used for devices for locking on. And I'm just trying to understand whether there would be a dialogue around that sort of granularity, around whether a strap in the back of a van might be considered as something that will be of concern to you, or whether it is just pointing towards legislation and saying you need to understand this yourselves.
No, I think our view, our start point was always to try and be as helpful as we could be. I don't know whether or not a discussion was had about any such straps in advance of the coronation, and I've seen various descriptions of what those straps are, but we can touch on that if needed. But I don't know if that actual discussion was had in advance.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Moving on now to Alison Thewlis.
Thank you very much. And I want to pick up where Simon left off and talk about the kinds of objects that would be covered by the new offence of being equipped to lock on. What's your understanding of that?
So I think it's contextual. I think in terms of, we need to look at, in terms of implementing law, you need to look at what the person's intent might be. You need to look at what the object is and then meet that with an intent or a likelihood of doing it, because clearly something like a D-lock could be used to lock on.
Could also be used to secure your bicycle.
Precisely. That's the point I'm
making. I was
making.
wearing a Just Stop Oil t-shirt and cycling along the road. Where's the context there and how would you interpret that?
So again, I mean, it's a hypothetical, but my point was exactly that, in that a seemingly innocent item could, in the right context, be something that would be considered to be going equipped for locking on. What we would do is we would base this on intelligence, we would base this on actions, we would base this on the group, and clearly at the time what we were talking about, if we draw this back to Golden Orb, was a situation where we had very clear intelligence that was deeply concerning, sufficiently so that we ended up briefing the Home Secretary and the Mayor late at night on the Friday, and we briefed senior stakeholders and partners late on the Friday and early on the Saturday, that there was a concerted attempt, there was going to be a concerted attempt to disrupt the coronation procession, and the officers were asked to be extremely vigilant and extremely proactive in dealing with this. So in the wider threat context, that would have played into some of the decision making, I think.
But there's no history of Republic ever having locked on, yet their members were arrested and presumably items that were securing the placards were taken by your officers.
Yeah, so we don't know that they were securing placards. That was what was said. The items themselves were in sort of clear plastic bags which were sealed, so they hadn't been used for that purpose as far as we could see in the van. But That's right. Officers have to make a difficult judgment at the time, in the moment, based on what they're faced with and based on the information they have. They have to form reasonable grounds for an arrest, and as the committee will know, reasonable grounds is actually quite a low threshold and is much lower than actually where you would need grounds to meet the evidential test to charge and a public interest test to charge. So what was found was 12 heavy-duty material straps with combination locks on them, which the officers were told were for securing placards, but at the time the officers were operating in a threat environment where they believed, taking into account the time, the location, proximity to the route, and what they had in front of them, those officers believed that those could be items that could be used for locking on, and that was why the arrest was made.
If you're looking more widely at such an item as a luggage strap, there must be thousands of people that go through central London every day with a luggage strap. How reasonable is it to assume that that kind of thing is a threat?
So I think that takes it straight back to the context, in that it was both in terms of the intelligence we had, the once-in-a-lifetime, once-in-a-generation event, the proximity to the event itself and to where we thought the threat was likely to manifest itself, and the time. There wasn't much time between these officers stopping the van and the actual ceremonial sort of procession taking place. So you're quite right. These items on their own in Heathrow Airport are not going to be something that might cause concern. If someone was walking around with 12 of them, there may be some questions asked. But this isn't something, you need more than just the item. I think the officers would need to show that there's some sort of intent or intelligence that would lead us to believe, in the context, that these could be items that we use for locking on.
Yeah, but this vagueness is in legislation now. So going forward, away from something like the coronation, which is a big one-off event, that could then be used at any point at any time to question somebody's ability to have something like a D-lock or a luggage strap or cable ties or anything of that kind, couldn't it?
I think it's then for the officers to show that they've acted both proportionately and reasonably. It's then to show that if somebody is arrested at the sort of threshold of reasonable suspicion, to then meet that evidential threshold is, a completely different step. And then if you get to that evidential threshold and they believe the CPS or the police believe there is sufficient to charge, then the courts will interpret that and will look at the circumstances. At the moment, you're right, there is no case law on this, but my point is that officers still need to act proportionately and reasonably, and that their actions need to be necessary in all of the circumstances. So I think the Saturday that we're talking about, whilst it was the first time this legislation was used, is also, I don't think, legislation that we're going to be used day in, day out, or even week in, week out, on the basis that, since it was passed, there have been 67, actually 68 now, other demonstrations that have taken place, and we have not used this legislation on any of them.
Can you tell me what it means to attach for the purposes of locking on?
So for me, locking on would be to secure yourself to something else. We'd have to take the ordinary dictionary definition.
Yeah, but to attach specifically?
As I said, I don't have the definition in front of me.
Holding hands, does that cover locking yourself to somebody else, gluing yourself to somebody else? What's the definition of that? My view on this is I would sort of look at a common sense definition in terms of what, securing yourself to someone else. I don't know, Chris may know a national sort of approach on this.
I think probably the example I would give, because it's one I shared with the Bill Scrutiny Committee, is at the G7 event, there was a scenario that policing encountered where they had information that individuals would be coming down to create devices and indeed potentially lock on at a protest. And indeed, at one point in time, I think they were stopped on the road and various bamboo poles and other things were discovered. Policing essentially had to let that run until eventually it became a substantive offence, and then they had to intervene and ultimately impacted much more on the rights of other people as well. So from an operational perspective, even though this might be very rarely used, and there is a degree of breadth in the framing of it, absolutely, you could have the scenario where someone's sitting down on a road potentially committing an offence, but people walking towards them with bicycle locks, very clear exactly what was going on, and police may well not have had the ability to intervene. So I think there are challenges around interpretation. I can see the concerns about, is this too broadly framed? What I would say is the imaginations of protest groups are also very broadly framed, and from a policing point of view, if the law is too narrow, it can essentially mean that that's much more easily circumvented for individuals looking to be unreasonable in their protest and cause serious disruption, but it has to be handled carefully.
Understand that the maximum penalty for locking on is a fine. Is detaining people appropriate?
So I think that's a matter for Parliament in terms of where the powers of arrest are drawn, and a matter for the courts. This offence may not sit in isolation as well, because where we have seen is the going equipped offence obviously would, but as Chris has alluded to, there may well be other offences that come into play as well, in those circumstances potentially causing a statutory public nuisance under Section 78. So this is a preventative measure, where at the moment, as Chris has alluded to, there wasn't the power to stop people who we had intelligence that were going to lock on until they did so, and that then led to a much greater disruption of other people's rights, because it then takes a long time to remove somebody who is locked on. So this enables us to have that proactive power to prevent that in the right circumstances.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just ask a question? I think earlier on, Assistant Commissioner Twist, you said that in certain circumstances there had to be a referral up to Bronze Command in terms of the public order, if there was going to be use of that. Did that happen in this particular case then? Can you assure us that Bronze Command were told that these people were going to be detained?
So this isn't policy. This is, and I'll answer the question, this isn't policy. This is something that we did given the short notice, and that we weren't sure that every inspector, every sergeant would have fully understood it. It was a constraint that we put on for this one operation. Right. And in terms of the specific question, yes, the Bronze Commander for the sector was notified of the arrest under this power.
Right. And did that Bronze Commander have the information about the engagement with Republic? Did they know what had been agreed and what was said? And
I don't know off the top of my head. My expectation would be that yes, that the whole command team would have been alert to engagement that had been taking place with Republic, because we would have been notified of that protest, so we would have been expecting it. But I don't know what was in her mind at the time.
You don't know what was in their mind?
I don't know in terms of, I can't put myself, whilst my expectation is that the Bronze was aware of the...
I'm just a bit surprised you've come today to explain what's happening, but you don't actually seem to know who knew what.
Well, I suppose...
you just to have found that out, but OK. Tim Lawton.
Thank you, Chair. Assistant Commissioner, can I just be clear? You said that the placards that were from the Republic group, which were in the component parts or whatever, there were luggage straps with combination locks with them. In your experience, have you seen other placards that have been attached using luggage straps with combination locks?
So, in my experience, no, but that doesn't mean that hasn't happened.
Right, but for you, it would be unusual by the sounds of it.
But for me, it would have been unusual, because normally we see the placards that are attached using cable ties or string or rope or something like that. I mean, these are heavy-duty things and the combination lock is part of them, so it sort of links together and then there's a combination on it. So it would have been unusual, which I think is why it would have aroused suspicion of the officers.
You usually use a combination lock to stop...
We're here today because our democracy...
Come on, officer. Come on, officer. Do your job. Come on, officer. No, we're not having this. Come on, officer.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Right, we're now back in session.
To be clear, they were just stop oil protesters who tried to undermine the activities of this committee with our witnesses today. Assistant Commissioner, just back to the use of combination locks. My understanding, you use a combination lock to stop somebody getting into something or undoing something to get into something. It's unusual to use them in order to assemble a placard or any other bits of wood? Just seems a bit odd, does it not?
So I think that's how you could read that, yes. And I suspect that was part of the grounds that were formed, that this was unusual.
And just back to the early conversation about somebody having a D-lock, where a defence would be, well, it's to secure my bicycle. But if somebody is at a demonstration without their bicycle, presumably they would have left that D-lock on the bicycle in order to secure it. So it's unusual to be carrying a D-lock without the bicycle.
One would have thought so.
Thank you. Can I just, the substantive question I want to ask is, ahead of the coronation, the Met tweeted, and I quote, that its tolerance for any disruption, whether through protest or otherwise, would be low, and that it would deal robustly with anyone intent on undermining this celebration. So notwithstanding the fact that this was the largest event probably ever, the largest assembly of world leaders that was there, how did you approach the policing of this event differently to justify that statement and sort of warning, effectively?
Yeah, so I think what's important is the difference between protest and disruption. And what we were talking about there, and we said that our tolerance of disruption would be low, but to be clear, it wasn't zero. We did say that we would have a zero tolerance of any breaches of safety or security, and that was part of the driven by the fact we had 312 protected people and the largest security operation we had ever run. What's clear is on the day, some disruption did happen. In the tens of thousands of people that came to watch the coronation and peacefully enjoy a once-in-a-lifetime event, there were large numbers of Not My King and other protest groups that were there shouting, making a noise, and whilst they were roundly booed by the crowd at different points, that to me points to officers striking the right balance in that we managed to allow, or large groups of protesters were able to be in the crowd and make, with very large signs, with very large banners, and peacefully coexist with the overwhelming majority of people who'd come to enjoy the celebration.
On that point, can you just finally sketch out, there was a big recognised, organised group of protesters in Trafalgar Square, I gather, and then various other groups. Roughly, I mean, were they were scattered all over the place in one group in Trafalgar Square? Were there several groups that were recognised and it was all fine? Just how many protesters roughly were there, and where were they?
So there were several hundred in and around Trafalgar Square that were originally sort of near to the corner where the procession was going to turn, and at one point they moved away and then came back again. We found, and this is where I sort of differentiate, there were other people who were protesting at various points in very small numbers across the route. And then we move into those who we were considering were going to present a criminal threat to the procession. So in this case, the Just Stop Oil activists, who we stopped both in Whitehall and at the bottom of Duke of York steps, where a large number of them were present. And we had intelligence, and we honestly believed that those people were going to seek to disrupt the coronation procession. So in my thinking, at that point, this was a conspiracy to commit public nuisance at the very least, and so we dealt with those from a criminal lens, not a protest lens.
In terms of the Republic protesters who were legitimately in a group in Trafalgar Square, there was no problem. None of those were arrested?
Not the ones that were there, as far as I'm aware.
Thank you.
Thank you. James Daly.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just for context, Commissioner, could you tell us how many people were in central London that day, roughly, in terms of numbers?
It's hundreds of thousands. In terms of the footprint itself, the numbers were constrained just through the organisers' need to maintain public safety, but across the whole footprint, there would have been hundreds of thousands of people in central London. The exact numbers I don't know.
Of course, you've given us an idea of that. And obviously, when you were policing any number of people or that size of population, then the safety and security of those people and everyone else in the area where they are is paramount.
Of course.
And it doesn't matter what your background is or what you're doing. You don't differentiate on that. The safety and security of people is what is at the core of the policing.
I think this touches on the human rights point that Chris referenced earlier. So there is a hierarchy in Article 2 in terms of our duties under right to life is more important than some of the other rights.
Absolutely.
So, of course, public safety and also the security of those people that we are protecting is critical.
Okay. You gave evidence to say that the Home Secretary and the London Mayor was briefed. Just give us an idea of what the intelligence was that you passed on to them. As long as it's not confidential, I don't know whether it's confidential or not. But
So clearly I can't go into the details of intelligence, but what I can say was that we were, during the course of the Friday the 5th and into the Saturday, on the evening of the Friday, I was concerned enough that the Home Secretary was briefed late in the evening, as was the London Mayor, on the growing intelligence picture, and then subsequent ministerial briefings happened in the morning. We were absolutely concerned that there were people who overnight were seeking to deface and spray historic monuments. We were concerned there were people who were going to incur onto the route. We were concerned there were people that were seeking to disrupt the coronation through loud noise. The use of rape alarms has been previously mentioned. And the intelligence that we had was real, and the threat that we had, that we believed at that time, was sufficiently serious that we needed to brief those key sort of ministers and officials.
Tell us the relationships. When we started speaking, we talked about that primary duty for the safety of both people and in this circumstance, horses and other animals that were part of the coronation. Could you tell us the link, please, between the intelligence and that duty to protect people who were there in central London that day?
Of course, we were deeply concerned that in the event of people incurring onto the route, and members may have seen the conditions for the horses were tricky enough as it was with the rain and everything else. There was a very real risk that had people incurred onto the route, or had they played sort of sudden, loud, amplified music, that could have literally scared the horses, which could have led to significant safety risk and potentially serious injury.
Okay, on the day, how many people were arrested in total for activity related to the coronation?
In total, 52 out of 64 arrests, and some of them were sort of, as you say, not linked. They were sort of picked up on the footprint, having been wanted for other matters, as an example.
Okay. So in terms of we're going to hear from a representative of Republic. It appears from the briefing that I've seen from Sir Mark Rowell, shall we say, the Met statement on this, that the position that the Met take is that the arrest of the 6 people was lawful. Do I understand that correctly? That may be challenged in a court later, it may be challenged through civil proceedings, may be challenged through all sorts of means.
Yes.
In terms of the position of the Met, is it that those arrests were lawful?
Yes.
And could you just, I'm not asking you to repeat, but just exactly again say why the Met say those arrests were lawful?
Because at that moment, those officers formed reasonable grounds to believe that the people they had detained were committing that offence. And it's for those officers and the state, taking into account the overall intelligence picture, the briefings they had, to justify why those reasonable grounds were formed. But from what I've seen, my belief, and we've touched on the difference between reasonable grounds to suspect and the evidential threshold needed to charge and to prove, but I believe they're lawful.
And so perhaps if you could develop this thing, I mean, the point has been made to you, I think, that why should people be put into custody if they are being arrested for an offence where there is not a custodial sentence at the end of it? I mean, perhaps if you could confirm to us, there are many, many offences and many, many occasions where people are arrested for offences where they are not going to receive a custodial sentence, even if they are charged with it, but they are taken into a custodial environment to allow for investigation of the circumstances of the arrest. Is that correct?
That's quite right, yes. I think, if I may, I've got some more detail on the arrests that may help the committee.
Thank you.
So I mentioned 64 in total across the weekend. 52 were linked to activists or potential direct action protest, and these included proactive arrests to prevent a breach of the peace and to cause public nuisance. We found a group of people in possession of white paint in plastic bottles, wearing high-vis jackets that could easily have been construed as stewarding jackets, but had Animal Rising logo on the sleeves. These were arrested for going equipped to cause criminal damage. We had intelligence in relation to Just Stop Oil intending to disrupt the procession. which resulted in the proactive identification of groups on the Mall and at Whitehall, which resulted in 23 arrests. 8 arrests were made for other offences, including possession of an offensive weapon, drugs, breaching a sexual harm prevention order. And our live facial recognition deployment at 3 locations led to 2 arrests. One suspect was wanted for breaching a sexual offence prevention order, where the index offence was rape, and the other was for going equipped to steal.
So,
Okay, last question, James. Yeah.
If it were the case that the Met position, as I say, the Met's position in respect to this can be challenged in all sorts of legal means, and that's a matter for the people involved in that. But if these arrests were lawful, if the behaviour from the police's perspective was absolutely correct, why apologise?
I think what we haven't said is an apology. What I said was that we regret that those that were detained and subsequently no further action was taken, we regret that they missed their opportunity to protest, and that's just a human thing to do. It's not... we don't want to get into the sort of dancing on pinheads about will you apologise, won't you? I believe that the arrest was lawful, but of course, once we've conducted further investigation and inquiries and we've found out more details of the engagement that had taken place and we've looked at all of the circumstances taken together, it's quite a human thing to do. Say, yeah, we regret that they missed their opportunity to protest, but what was also very clear is that many hundreds didn't miss that opportunity and were continued on with that protest, which is quite contrary to some of the reporting we've seen that all protest was banned, which clearly wasn't the case.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Carolyn Harris.
Thank you, Chair. Overall, it was an excellent day. And the police did a really good job. But this incident has probably been a big takeaway for a lot of people and has marred what was otherwise an excellent day. What would you have done, retrospectively, what could you have done differently to have stopped this happening?
So, as always with any big event, there's going to be a full operational debrief, which we always do and we always look to improve. My initial sort of takeaway from this would be, had we been better able to connect those officers that were making the arrests and sort of forming their reasonable grounds with the protest liaison teams, who were also deployed but elsewhere on the footprint, that may, and I stress may, have led to a different outcome. However, what's also very clear is that even if the protest liaison teams had confirmed that there had been engagement with those individuals, that doesn't mean that arrest is impossible, because clearly people engage and they don't tell us the truth, and clearly people engage with other nefarious motives in mind. To give you a sense of the scale, though, as to why that was difficult and why we will look at and see how we can do better, on the day itself, the policing operation was split across 9 geographic sectors, with additional functional commands dealing with things like protection or traffic or security of firearms. We had 51 active radio channels across 9 sectors, and that's not including the protection channels, which added another 80 or so to it. So in the context of a fast-moving environment, in the context of a very high threat as we saw it, I can see why that didn't happen. But in terms of our debrief point, I think that would be one of the things that I would focus on.
This will go through Hydro process, presumably. But in terms of the police officers involved, were they overzealous? Were they nervous of the fact that it was such a high-profile event and they didn't want to be seen to be doing something which wasn't overly precautious?
So I don't know if that's the case. I mean, everybody knew the significance of the event, and officers were briefed as to the intelligence, and we had put in place measures where the Bronze Commander would be briefed if we were going to use this specific legislation. We all knew the importance of the safety and security that we've touched on already, because that was whilst ensuring that those that wished to peacefully protest could do so. So I don't think overzealous is the right word. I think, of course, we were cautious, but in the context of the largest security operation we've ever run, the once-in-a-generation, once-in-a-lifetime event, and no second chances to get it right.
Thank you. That's it, Chair. Thank you.
Marco Longhi.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. First of all, again, my own congratulations for how the operations were on the day and the preparations for them as well. Would I be correct in saying that the reasonable grounds for believing that a person's arrest being necessary and that threshold being met for the 52 that you personally, the police, in their judgment, decided were necessary on the day, could potentially include for the fact that other members of the public, the members of the forces parading the procession, could have come to harm.
So I think that's part of the overall context. I don't think that's part of the reasonable grounds itself. I think that could link to the necessity test. But I think for me, the reasonable grounds is based on what the officers see the individuals doing, but obviously taking into account the wider context that we've alluded to.
If a consequence of a potential disruptive act is that others could come to harm, would the police be duty-bound to take action?
If the individual was committing an offence and there was a power attached to it, then yes, we would absolutely. If one of the things that you would consider in terms of the necessity to make an arrest would be the harm to others or the continuing harm to others.
But you just said if there is if a person is committing an offence, I think police can make an arrest if they believe that there might be a risk that an offence might be committed.
That is also true.
Right. So, as I was walking into Parliament this morning, I was walking across Westminster Bridge, and these people who were sat behind you just a few moments ago were walking very slowly, and there was an enormous amount of traffic behind, potentially with ambulances being prevented from getting to people who might have needed help quickly. Would it not be in the police's judgment in those circumstances that harm could come to people?
I can help with that specifically. So this was a Just Stop Oil protest on Westminster Bridge. It started at 08:42 hours when they started marching towards Parliament. Our first public order officers were there at 08:46. Our first commander was there at 08:51. Conditions were imposed on that group at 08:56 and they moved off the road. Whilst we've been sat here in committee, at 09:57, the same group moved onto Parliament Square, breaching those conditions, and officers started an engagement process with a view to moving to enforcement. Because I've been sat here, I don't know what the outcome of that is, but in terms of 14 minutes from start to conditions being imposed and the road clear, I think that's quite a good performance this morning.
Okay, thank you.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Assistant Commissioner, for coming here today. And like Marco, I think you did a great job on the day, so thank you for that, and a big thank you to the officers. But the more cynical amongst us, and I'm not cynical, by the way, the more cynical amongst us may think that you just turned up on this day because it was a special occasion, a big occasion, and did a really, really good job. What can you say to the public and to this committee to say that's not the case, that we take this very seriously, and we will do this on a more regular basis now in London, because like Marco said earlier, we see these protests almost on a daily basis, and I think the public and some of us have lost a little bit of confidence, but we sort of regained that during the coronation.
Thank you. I think as we touched on at the start, getting the balance right between qualified rights of protesters and the impact they have is difficult, particularly where they're using disruptive tactics. If I can reassure you, though, in terms of the Just Stop Oil activity that we've seen, in the pre-Christmas period where we were dealing principally with conspiracies to block the motorway or people sitting down in the road, we made 754 arrests. Those are all now progressing through the criminal justice system, or most of them are. But that was an abstraction of 12,500 officer shifts, which still continues, and those are people abstracted from community policing. Since the Just Stop Oil action that started a few weeks ago, this is their 12 weeks of action, so far we've seen 56 slow marches. We've imposed Section 12 Public Order Act conditions on 40 of those, and that's led to 29 arrests, because in the main the use of conditioning has worked. But so far, because this is bigger and more disparate, that's already used over 9,300 officer shifts. So I think the community are right to be concerned in terms of the amount of time and effort that we're spending having to deal with disruptive protest. But also, I think members of the committee should be reassured that we have a good operational plan, and as is evident from this morning's activity, we are dealing robustly where people are just effectively hell-bent on causing disruption to the overwhelming majority of others going about their lawful business.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I'm going to return to Joanna Cherry for a short question.
Thanks. I'm a bit troubled by the statement you made, Mr. Twist, about the fact that you were booed by the crowd when you were arresting people, suggested you'd got the balance right. Can you expand upon that?
No, it's the other way round. The crowd were booing the protesters.
Okay.
And when officers intervened...
No, you're absolutely right. Forgive me, that's my sloppy question. My question is this. Are you seriously suggesting, as a senior police officer, that the fact that the protesters were being booed by other people and then you went ahead and arrested them, the fact that they were being booed suggests that you got the balance right? Is that really your evidence to this parliamentary committee?
No. That's not what I meant at all. That was an observation as part of our evidence that... And when we talk about the people that were arrested, to be clear, the people that were arrested, in terms of those in larger groups, were those that we believed were part of the criminal conspiracy to disrupt the procession. Those that were arrested, if we're talking about the Republic protesters, were done at a van in St Martin's Lane, which wasn't part of where the large crowds were, so that wasn't relevant to that at all. So if I mentioned that in my evidence, what I said was that there was a large group of protesters that was in Trafalgar Square, and they were at various points booed by the crowd, but that was evidence that we were striking a balance right. We didn't arrest any of those people. They were left there, and they were able to chant whatever they wanted about "Not My King," and the crowd were able to boo them as they wanted to, but that didn't lead to any police intervention.
Okay, well, I'm glad you've clarified that, because the reason I'm asking it is that the Commissioner pointed out that celebrating crowds applauded and cheered as arrests were made in the Mall area. And I think Mr Wagner, who we're going to hear from later, said that suggested that the Met weren't taking the human right to protest seriously. I'm just worried about this. I'm worried about the idea that it's a good thing to arrest people if the crowd don't like them.
No, it's not.
It's of the essence of our constitutional democracy that minority rights are protected, or unfashionable views are protected. Do you accept that?
So I don't think that's what happened. I don't think that's what we're saying. I think what we were saying is this was just an observation. And I think from a policing duty point of view, it is our duty to enforce the law without fear or favour, whether 1% of the population support a cause or 99% of the population support a cause.
Thank you. Okay, Alison Thewlis, I think you just have one small question you wanted to ask.
Yes. Have you issued an apology to Alice Chambers, the Australian that got arrested by mistake?
So at this time, there's an ongoing complaint. I'm aware of the circumstances of Miss Chambers, and there's an ongoing complaint which is going to be investigated in the proper fashion. And once that's been done, we'll consider what correspondence we need to have with her.
Okay. Can I just ask two very quick questions? Why did it take 16 hours for those arrested on suspicion of being equipped to lock on to be released?
So it does seem like a long time. The process of custody is quite rigorous. It's quite formulaic. In this case, circumstances such as if five of the suspects had the same legal advice, there would need to be a process of that lawyer engaging with the individual, then going into interview, so it would be done in sequence, not in parallel, where there's only one legal advisor.
What happened?
Yes.
They had one legal advisor, and that
for five of them.
For five
yes.
of them. Okay, that's what you're saying. Okay, and the other thing is, I just wanted to ask, what communications did you have with Westminster City Council in relation to Night Stars?
So, quite extensive communications actually. On the night at the time of the stop, the inspector on duty at Westminster Control Room spoke to the Westminster City Council Local Authority Liaison Officer and asked about the volunteers organisation. Unfortunately, the council officer we spoke to couldn't confirm knowledge of that organisation, although that didn't mean it didn't exist. He was at pains to say that the person didn't know about it. The Met Gold Commander spoke to the Council Gold on the 6th, 7th and 8th of May, and also with the Chief Executive across the days. The Met's Neighbourhood Superintendent also spoke with the Leader of the Council on the 6th of May, and the Met BCU Commander has been in contact with members of the Council. On the 7th of May...
Hey, you're telling me then the Met didn't know about this organisation within London? that operates within Westminster?
Not the Met. The officers that were dealing with them at the time didn't. And the local authority liaison officer, who was called out of hours...
He didn't know.
He didn't know, but that didn't mean that they didn't exist. It just
clearly they existed, didn't they?
That just meant that he didn't...
Nobody seemed to know about them. Okay.
That just meant he didn't know.
Okay. Seems to be a bit of a communication issue going on, really, doesn't there, about people not knowing what other people know?
So I think the officers did the best they could. We had an inspector call Westminster City Council and ask about the group, and the person we spoke to, who was the duty liaison officer, didn't know. So
some lessons of communication for Westminster City Council and for the Metropolitan Police.
And we always learn from these things.
Okay. Can I thank you very much indeed for coming along this morning and giving your evidence. I also want to say one other thing, which is we take very seriously that Parliament should be open to members of the public. That's very important. But we also take very seriously that we should not be disrupted from our job of scrutinising, particularly what happened in this case. I also just want to thank the security and the police officers who acted very quickly to ensure that the session could continue. But again, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Grateful.
We'll
Thank
now
you.
move to our second panel.
James.
Very much for patiently waiting for the panel to start. As you know, we are rather restricted on time, so again, if I could just say if people could answer briefly, that would be very helpful, and if members of the committee could be brief in their questioning as well, that would be very good. I'd like to start by asking each of our panel members just to introduce themselves and explain why they're here today. So, Graham, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'm Graham Smith. I'm CEO of Republic and one of the 8 people, not 6, who were arrested from Republic on May 6 without any lawful justification.
Thank you.
No basis whatsoever. Adam Wagner, and I'm a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers, and I am an expert in protest law.
Thank you.
I'm Suzie Melvin. I'm one of the 3 Night Stars who was arrested.
Thank you. So what we'd like to do really is to start just actually by asking Graham and Suzie if you could just explain what actually happened, if you could just tell your story to us. We appreciate that you've obviously been through a difficult and traumatic experience, so please just take your time. We just want to hear what happened to you.
Thank you, and I appreciate those last comments because some people have tried to downplay the arrest and detention of people as an inconvenience. It is a traumatic experience for people and should be taken very, very seriously. I had written to the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police in January. We had 2 meetings with senior officers on the 8th of February and the 24th of March, as well as a number of phone call conversations and email exchanges with a junior officer who was our dedicated liaison officer. We had been abundantly clear with them right the way through the process exactly what we were planning to do. We told them how many placards we would have and what they would say on them. We told them that we would have these large flags that you would have seen in the footage. We told them that we would have amplifiers for the purposes of making speeches to the crowd. We told them we would have megaphones. We gave them a map which showed them where we would have the main protest and that there would be other smaller protests on the Mall and on Whitehall. We gave them every piece of information we possibly could. It's possible that the occasional tiny minutiae might have slipped through and not been communicated, but they were very clear with us that they did not have a single concern about any of the things which we told them we were going to do. When we told them, for example, that we had these 3-metre flags, they said that they would be concerned that they might fall into the parade route, and so we made it abundantly clear that we would be keeping them back well away from the parade route towards the back of the crowd. So at all stages, and it should be obviously noted that we are under no obligation whatsoever to communicate with the police. It's a static protest which does not require permission, but we were concerned by an arrest that occurred in 2011 on the day of William and Kate's wedding, and arrests that happened and threats of arrest that happened immediately after the death of the Queen. So we were keen to engage, and we gave them every possible cooperation and involvement. And during that time, we had protests in 4 other cities and London, in which were peaceful, where we engaged with the liaison officers, where those officers were professional and helpful. We never had any intention of doing anything which even came close to falling outside of the law. And the claim that they had intelligence could not possibly be true. Either they're being dishonest or they are making a very serious error, because you cannot have intelligence relating to a republic, because there was not a single email, text message, WhatsApp message, conversation, fleeting remark or anything that would suggest at all that we had any intention of doing anything unlawful or disruptive. We were also told, because we said to them in these meetings, would you obviously make sure that everybody on the ground understands what we're doing? And they said yes, and that people, including the bronze commanders, had been fully briefed as to what was going on. So on the day, we had stayed the previous 2 nights in a hotel on St Martin's Lane. We went down to Trafalgar Square at 6 o'clock in the morning with a number of pieces of equipment, including our flags and amplification equipment. We were immediately approached by a number of officers, including the bronze commander, who seemed not being helpful, but seemed quite hostile, and seemed to give the impression that they didn't know who we were, what we were doing, and what our intentions were. And they were I actually texted them a message to the liaison officer saying, "Your officers are being somewhat difficult." I then went up the road to meet my colleague who was driving the van down from North London with the placards. He was having some difficulty navigating, so I jumped in the van with him, and we parked up on St Martin's Lane. We opened the back of the door, and immediately we were surrounded by large numbers of tactical support group officers who were not in remotely friendly or helpful mindset. They immediately told us to stop what we were doing. I attempted to phone the liaison officer, and he told me that he was therefore detaining me and did not allow me to do that. I attempted again, and he seized my wrist and removed my phone from my hand, and again told me I could not do that. I told him that we had had these meetings with a superintendent and a civil commander. He said, what was the name of that person? I told him. He clearly recognised that name, and he said that did not matter. I repeated that we had had these meetings, as did a colleague of mine also repeat that. They obviously had no reason to believe that we had anything on the van other than the placards, which is not an offence, obviously. It's not an offence to park up and unload placards. We had 2 large trolleys which we had hired, and the straps were there to strap the large bundles of placards to the trolleys so that we could quickly and efficiently, with minimal disruption, get them down onto Trafalgar Square. The straps would have gone back into the van. The van was then going to be driven back to North London and left there for the duration of the day.
In your extensive discussions with the police, had you mentioned these straps?
No, because we hadn't realised until we had them delivered a few days earlier that they were quite cumbersome to move. So I simply went on Amazon, found the first straps I saw, picked them mainly because they were yellow, which matched everything else we were carrying, and threw them in the van, still in the packaging. So, and they are not physically capable. As our solicitor pointed out when she arrived at the station, and as they, I believe, have now accepted, that they were not physically capable of locking people on. They may have the combination lock, but they also have an adjuster like any bag strap. They're quite long. They're also very easy to cut. So they're not particularly heavy duty. They are the sort of strap you might strap around your case if you're going into an airport.
Is there anything else you want to tell us at this point? We will want to ask you some further questions.
Of course. Well, only that I'm very concerned by the statements that have been made today by the police, and in the letter that they sent to Sadiq Khan, there's a lot of claims there which are simply untrue. And I'm concerned by the suggestion that we were there for 16 hours, partly because of processing. I know the officer told me at 1 p.m. in the afternoon that he was ready to interview me, and after that I could go. I was then told just a couple of days ago that our solicitor arrived around 1 p.m. It was 6 p.m. before I was interviewed, and I was the first of our 8 to be interviewed, or the first of the 6 in that station. So I would really like to, I would hope that this committee can get answers as to whether there was political interference, who made what decision, and whether this is premeditated, because it certainly had the impression that they had turned up with the intention of detaining us. And I would also, just very quickly, I appreciate time, the notion that we were still able to protest. We weren't, we were in cells. But the protest was significantly disrupted and diminished as a result of their actions. They continued throughout the day. They confiscated our amplifiers, even though they had said that we were allowed to use them. They threatened arrest of the people with megaphones and then arrested 2 people with megaphones. And I do know for a fact that large numbers of people then left or didn't turn up because of those arrests.
Right, OK. Joanna, is your question specifically on that? Do you want to ask a very quick question, then I'm going to take Suzie?
I just want to ask you a very quick question. Clearly, and you heard, the police have used the luggage straps as the justification for detaining you and arresting you. But you described there large numbers of police arriving and swarming round. At that stage, had anyone seen the luggage straps, or were they still inside the van?
They were still inside the van. They stopped us and detained us for searching before they'd seen any luggage straps.
Thank you.
Right, thank you. Suzie, would you just explain what happened in your case?
So we commenced the Night Star shift at 7 p.m. on Friday the 5th of May. And as part of the Night Stars, we patrol various areas, including Soho, Leicester Square, the Embankment. And so we were walking around, myself and my colleagues, with our rucksacks, high visibility vests, and the rucksacks would contain things like bottles of water, sick bags, slippers, lollipops, hairbands, ponchos, anything you'd need at the end of a night out, really. And as we were walking around, we were speaking to members of the police force, as we always do when we're on patrol. Most of the night, it was quite quiet compared to a normal Friday night. So we were mainly giving directions to people from outside of London as to where they could go to watch the coronation. So we'd gone back to St Anne's Church, which is where we based ourselves out of, and had some dinner. And myself and my 2 colleagues I was arrested with, we'd made the decision that because it was quite a quiet night, we'd do a final circuit around Soho, which is generally the busiest area, and then we would go home. So we started walking towards Soho, and Soho Square is always the last area that we would patrol because there's often people waiting for taxis on their own there. And a large part of our role is trying to keep people safe, particularly towards the end of a night out. So if we see people who are on their own waiting for an Uber, say, we'll offer to wait with them so that they can feel safer and they're not at risk of sort of incurring any crime. So as we were entering the north side of Soho Square, we were approached by a number of TSG vans, and then a large number of officers got out of vans and they approached us and said that they were going to stop and search us. So we were kept separate, and the officers looked through our bags, checked our pockets. We explained to them who the Night Stars were, showed them emails from Westminster City Council, showed them the Night Stars website. We gave them leaflets which had been printed by Westminster City Council, our high visibility vests, which do display the Met Police logo as well, because we're in partnership with the Met Police, have a QR code on them which links back to the Westminster City Council website as well.
Sorry to interrupt you. Did you say then you're in partnership? You work in partnership with the Metropolitan Police?
Yes.
Okay, right. Sorry to interrupt.
No problems. So we did the best that we could to try and explain who we were to the officers, and then they also searched the church that we base ourselves out of. And we were then taken in police vans we were told we were going to be arrested and taken in police vans to Woolworth police station, where we were held. I was interviewed at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon the following day, and then we were released a little bit after 4 o'clock on Saturday the 6th of May.
Goodness, that's such a long time for you to be detained.
Yes, it was, yeah.
Right, okay. I'm a bit speechless, actually, having heard that account of what happened to you and your colleagues. Right, okay. Well, thank you both for setting out so clearly what happened. That's very helpful to the committee. We're going to have some questions. So, Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Chair. My question is for Graham. Thank you for coming, Graham, today. Now, after your arrest and the time spent in the cells, my inbox sort of exploded a little bit, and people were saying that it was right that you was arrested. You was described as a trouble causer, a public nuisance, and you're just there to ruin people's days out. That's their words, not mine. I've looked at your website, and it says that you embrace democracy. So I guess my question, I've only got one question for you, is if you embrace democracy so much, why don't you put your placards away and stand for election?
I don't know that that's particularly relevant to the inquiry,
I think we're interested in what happened to you on that day and whether the law was appropriately and properly
I'm happy
applied.
to sit here and tell you all about why the monarchy is a bad thing and why we should be a republic, but I think we are actually focusing on the policing.
We haven't got time to go into all of that today. I'm sure we would like to perhaps have that discussion, Lee.
That's my question.
Right,
my question.
Thank you very much. OK, we're going to go to Alison Thewlis next.
Thank you very much, Chair. I wanted to ask Adam Wagner, can you tell me, do you think the Public Order Act will have a chilling effect on peaceful protest, and if so, why?
I mean, you've already heard the evidence that it is having a chilling effect on peaceful protests. It's only been in force for about 10 days. You heard evidence from Mr. Smith that people didn't turn up in the from their protest, which sounds like it would have been an entirely lawful protest. I'm really concerned that it will have a chilling effect. I think the main reason is that you've got these extremely wide offences and widely drawn offences, particularly coming equipped for locking on, which, as I think you pointed out, could include sellotape, duct tape, a lock, luggage, straps. It's almost anything you can imagine really that could be used to lock on. But that's only the beginning of the powers, because that's a gateway offence within the scheme of the Act, which allows police, first of all, to arrest and detain if they have reasonable belief an offence is going to be committed, but also to impose suspicionless search areas. So this is a tactic that's been taken from violent crime and gang type behaviour, and they're imposing it on peaceful protest. So what that means is an officer who has reasonable grounds to believe, for example, amongst other things, locking on offences are going to be committed, and bearing in mind that you've heard the paraphernalia that can be used for locking on happens to be the same as the paraphernalia people bring to protests to tie together signs and what have you. So you could include any particular protest. They can then search people without suspicion in that area for up to 24 hours. They can also impose serious disorder prevention orders, serious disruption prevention orders, which will then potentially prevent people from entering areas and then lead to criminal and to prison if they don't. And all of that package for your average person, so not your sort of hardcore protester who's willing to risk arrest and prison and full respect to people who those people who are willing to put their beliefs on the line in that way. But the vast majority of people who turn up to protest are not those people. They are people who are going to be thinking, well, I don't want to be the Suzie. I don't want to be who wasn't even there for the protest, was there for something else. I don't want to be caught in the dragnet of this Public Order Act. I believe in this cause, but I'm not willing to risk my job, risk being in the newspapers as a radical protester because I've been arrested or detained. No smoke without fire and all of that. So I think you will see, first of all, a chilling effect, but second of all, a radicalisation of the people who end up protesting, which is it will end up being a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way.
I'm quite interested, as an MP from Scotland, that maybe people coming from Scotland down to London to protest against the various measures that happen at this place might not make that trip because they see that as a risk, not being able to get their train back or not being able to get back home in good time.
Yeah, because they're putting themselves in the targets of this incredibly wide law, and I can entirely understand why they would be really worried. Because being detained, and I think that the point Graham made at the very beginning is very important, and I act for lots of people who have been detained by police, with cause, without cause. It's an extremely traumatic experience. You heard Graham say he had his phone taken off him, and that others had their phones taken off them as well. These are really sort of oppressive potential powers. They're necessary to prevent crime. But why would you risk? It turns peaceful protest into something which is, a really important part of democracy to something which is a real sort of personal risk.
Thank you. Joanna Cherry.
Adam, can I ask you, you heard the evidence, the questions I asked the police officers about balancing the right to peaceful protest with the need to protect those who might be impacted by such a protest. Do you think the Metropolitan Police, well, can you tell us a bit about what you think the balance should be as a matter of law, and can you tell us whether you think the Met Police got the balance right the day of the coronation?
As a matter of law, as a matter of human rights law, I think the balance should be very clearly on the basis that peaceful protest is permitted unless it's likely to lead to violence. And there may be some wriggle room around that where you have, for example, blocking the highway, committing criminal offences. But in a democratic society, protest is a very important way of communicating, citizens communicating with the people in power, and that should be preserved. I think the problem with this, with the Public Order Act and also the Police and Crime Act, is whether you describe it as a balance or a human rights as at the top of the hierarchy, or however you sort of conceptualize it, undoubtedly this legislation is changing the balance, because what it does is it turns something which used to be part of the accepted impact, collateral impact of a protest, which is disruption, into a crime. And once you do that, it makes it seem like all protest, in particular, and for example, political protest, which a lot of protest is itself a bad thing for society. And I think the problem with that is, in a democratic society, peaceful political protest in human rights law, but also in our British tradition, is a political issue. It's a matter for politicians. And what this legislation does is it turns it very much into a police issue and a public order issue. So while with the greatest respect to Matt Twist and the Metropolitan Police, who will try to deal with that balance, if the scales are being tipped as they are by this legislation, it's going to be very, very difficult for them to achieve right balance in a democracy.
Just looking at the evidence that Suzie and Graham have given us, I mean, I'm qualified in law north of the border, you're qualified in law south of the border. In Scotland, we have a concept of wrongful arrest, and an arrest where there aren't proper grounds for it, or where somebody's human rights have been breached. People can sue for wrongful arrest, can't they, and seek damages for the trauma and of being locked up for hours on end when there was no good reason for it. Is it the same in England?
It would also be a false imprisonment or an unlawful detention. So if there was no reasonable grounds for arrest, one thing that Mr. Twist didn't mention is there doesn't just have to be reasonable grounds. There also has to be necessity to arrest. It's a two-part test. So you can have a suspicion, but then you have to also look at the officer in charge has to look at the circumstances and say, well, yeah, I have that suspicion, but do I need to arrest? Is it necessary to arrest and detain this person? And you have to ask the question, it's difficult to know without seeing the full facts of any case what the legal sort of answer is. But yeah, I suspect that we'll see what the outcome of, I suspect you'll see, as much as Mr. Twist was defending those actions, I suspect there will be some fairly swift settlements of those cases.
Thank you. Lawton.
Thank you, Chair. Mrs. Smith, can I just preface my question to you by saying I'm sure there are people on this committee who fundamentally disagree with your views and that of the organisation, and those who fundamentally agree. That is not the point of today's questioning. All of us agreed on your right to protest your cause. The issue is the proportionality and the policing of that. Can you tell me what you and your organisation hoped to achieve on the day of the coronation?
We were very clear in the run-up to this that we wanted to essentially challenge what, in our view, was not a national celebration but a royal and state celebration, which polls were showing a minority were enthusiastic about. We wanted to use the opportunity to get our message across, which is that in a democracy we should have an election instead of a coronation, and that instead of being told it's going to be Charles, we ought to have a choice of our head of state. And we wanted to be very clear in front of the world's cameras that we are not a nation of royalists, that whilst that view is often projected in the media, the polling shows that the people's views are quite nuanced and divided. So we wanted to create that debate and get people's voices heard. I appreciate that obviously still a majority support the retention of the monarchy, but the polling is very different. So we would essentially, like any protest group, we wanted to be very clear about our message and get that message out to a wide audience.
Do you think that actually you were more successful in getting publicity for your organisation and your cause by the fact that 8 of your members, including you, were arrested, which seems to have scored rather more headlines and today's proceedings here than if none of you had been arrested at all?
Well, I wouldn't say the word successful. I would say that that is the case, that we had more coverage. It wasn't a success in the sense that we didn't aim to do that, and I would not wish to do that. It was a very heavy price to pay for that coverage, both in terms of the loss of liberty of 8 of our people, both staff and volunteers, for a whole day, and all the stress that comes with that, as well as the very serious impact on people's rights to protest. I would much rather that the police had honoured their assurances and allowed us to get on with the protest as we had planned.
You've just said that your aim was to get maximum publicity for your cause and your beliefs. That's perfectly reasonable. But by having those 8 people arrested and subsequently what has happened made it impossible to ignore, which is what you wanted, wasn't it?
Well, yes, but as I said, it wasn't our objective. So successful for us, we were very clear, what a successful day meant for us was to be able to peacefully protest, to have speeches, to be near the procession route, and during that peaceful protest to attract attention through the national and international media. So that was successful in our mind, and that did not happen. So yes, by implication, or whatever, as a result of those arrests, we got much more publicity. But that is not successful in our minds as a peaceful campaign.
As part of those intended activities would have made it impossible to ignore?
Well, the fact that we were there in fairly large numbers right on the edge of the procession, and we had other protests along the route, and that by doing that we were engaging with the media, who would have had and certainly the broadcast media would have had an obligation to engage with the fact that there are both protesters and also a diversity of opinion around the issue. So
that didn't happen, did it? Because I can't recall any footage of your organisation protesters in Trafalgar Square. I absolutely, as does everybody else, recall what happened to 8 of your protesters.
Indeed, but I would certainly be taking that up with the BBC, because I have complained to them many times that their coverage of royal events is atrocious, and the fact that they didn't cover it is something you'll have to take up with them.
Okay, well, we can all complain about the BBC in various terms, but what I'm just interested in is on your website, I quote, it says, on Saturday the 6th of May, the eyes of the world will be on the coronation. I'll agree with that. This is the moment we make our objection loud, visible, and impossible to ignore, and you invited people to sign up for that. So what really was your intention? Doesn't anybody reading that could get the impression that actually there was something rather more severe planned, a peaceful demonstration involving a few placards which may or may not be ferried to the place of protest by some combination luggage straps?
No, because there is obviously, we have a history of peaceful protest. We have been very clear about what that protest would look like. It was going to be, we had about 2,000 people already telling us that they would be there, and they would be amassed in a crowd on Trafalgar Square, and if the cameras and the BBC and everybody else was covering it reasonably and fairly, then you would see it as part of the coronation coverage. That was our plan. Now, whether that would have worked, I don't know, but that was the plan. We are a peaceful campaign group. We always have been. And we have never had any intention of causing any disruption, as we have made clear to not just the Met, but every other police force where we have protested. So, no, it is not reasonable to make any conclusions.
What is your definition of disruption? You've said that you had loudspeaker equipment and megaphones, where there were the majority of people who located themselves on the route were there to enjoy the spectacle, the bands and the music that went with it. But do you not agree that if you had somebody bellowing with the use of a megaphone and loudspeakers, things that were contrary to what people had come there to see, that surely is disruptive for the many hundreds of thousands of people who come there to enjoy spectacle and the music and everything to go with it?
Well, arguably, yes. But I mean, the point is that there are people there who were there to demonstrate their support for the monarchy, and there were people there that were demonstrating their opposition to the monarchy, and both had equal rights to be there. And there were far more of them, so therefore the noise for them would be louder than us. There were more of them, so they would be more visible. There was plenty of space where people could watch the procession without us
Why
being
was
in
it
their way.
necessary to have megaphones and loudspeaker equipment if it was not intended to be disruptive?
The disruption that we're talking about in the context of this discussion is the sort of disruption of locking on, getting into the route and that sort of thing. If we talk about disruption in terms of diminishing their PR, that's a whole different matter.
No,
yes.
Is a megaphone and use of loudspeakers where people are there to listen and take in the spectacle, not by your own definition, disruptive, which is what actually you intended to be?
Well, obviously protest wants to be...
is it disruptive
noticed.
or not, Mr. Smith?
Well, it's disruptive only in the sense that it is disrupting the PR aspect of the parade.
PR, it's about hundreds of thousands of people who come there to enjoy the spectacle and listen to the music and various other...
Thousands of people...
The use of a megaphone and loudspeakers to drown over that noise is, by your own definition, disruptive, which is what your intention was it not?
We raised these matters with the police, and they were very clear that it did not breach the law simply because we could not physically disrupt the piece because there were many more of them than there were of us. So even with amplification, they had no concerns with it. And I should say, again, they were abundantly clear that they had absolutely no concerns about any of our plans whatsoever right up until Friday, the 5th of May.
Right.
So, these are not disruptive in the sense that you're trying to suggest.
Okay, thank you. Carolyn Harris.
Thank you, Chair. Adam, as a politician, I've been known to protest. I've been out there on Parliament Square with a whole load of menopausal women, and we've had our say, and we've had an opportunity to vent how we're feeling. Do you think what happened on that day is going to stop that kind of passive, if you like, protest, and it's going to see more aggressive protesting, that people will be afraid? People like me who don't want to get into trouble with the police will be afraid to have our say, and the door will be open to more aggressive protesting.
I think this language is really interesting. Disruption that Mr. Loughton's been talking about, aggressive protest, passive protest. Protest is about getting yourself heard particularly by people in power, but also by your fellow citizens. And I think that in a way, the perfect protest movement is a mass protest movement where you've got in lots of people who agree because you've convinced them that is the right method of, well, it's the right idea. And the problem, these laws are really focusing in on those mass protest movements, and they're making them a lot more difficult to organise. And I think the genesis of the Powers and the Public Order Bill came originally after Extinction Rebellion. They weren't a response to insulate Britain and sort of road blockages. They were about the mass protests in Extinction Rebellion, which were, in the most part, peaceful and creative and engaging. They engaged people with the ideas. They were very politically focused. And I think that we should be encouraging that in society. And one of the reasons is we want new ideas. It's really important. But the other reason is it's always seen, I think a good democracy understands that protest is the release of a safety valve. It's a release of pressure to allow people to go out and say, this is what I feel, and this is important to me, and to do it in a way which is a bargain. And in the case law in the courts, they talk about civil disobedience and the bargain between the society and the individuals. And it's worrying that you hear Mr. Loughton's questions. For me, we're quite sort of almost quite sinister, and I don't mean that as a personal point. I just mean the questioning itself, as in you bring a loudspeaker to a coronation, to a political event. It's not just everybody enjoying themselves. It's a very highly political event, the coronation of a constitutional monarch, in a system where people disagree and agree vehemently with whether there should or shouldn't be a king. And I think the idea that you could not bring a loudspeaker to a protest, which is almost this sort of bread and butter of mass protests, is a loudspeaker amplification, is really worrying. And I think that's the direction of travel, that you have politicians saying, well, you were just trying to disrupt things with your loudspeaker by getting, but people are just enjoying themselves. I think that's really worrying. I think it's worrying for democracy. And I think we need to, we're in the early stages of it, but I think we need to sort of just take a check now.
Suzie, can I come to you? Congratulations on the work you do. We have a similar outfit in Swansea called Street Pastors, and it is so important, the work that you do, and I thank you for that.
You're here.
Has what happened to you put you off volunteering, or will it put other people off actually becoming involved in something that could end up with, because of what happened to you, potential difficult circumstances?
So it hasn't put me off personally, but I can certainly see that it would dissuade other people from volunteering if there's a risk that you could be arrested and detained in the course of carrying out your volunteering. So it certainly is a worry.
And one last quick question. Throughout your ordeal, the fact that you go out on a regular basis, throughout your ordeal, did you encounter any police officer that you knew from your previous trips out with the Street Stars?
No, the police officers who were sort of dealing with us were from a separate area from London. The areas that they normally cover did have similar organisations as well, and I did give the names of some of the Metropolitan police officers that I do know from the Soho area, and I don't believe that any of them were contacted.
Thank you. Thank you, Suzie. Thank you, Chair.
Helpful, thank you. We'll now move to James Daly.
Can I just check what time the hearing finishes?
Well, we have Prime Minister's question time at 12 noon, so we do try and finish before then. Okay. But I'm conscious people have got questions they want to ask, so I'll let it run a little bit.
Mr. Wagner, you're not here as a lawyer, are you? You're here as a political activist. You're giving opinions, political opinions, which are, calling my colleague Mr. Lawton sinister is a new one for this committee. Yeah. But if you are here as a political activist and you have set political views, it was up to the committee who they wanted to invite.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you there, James, because we invited Adam along because he'd worked with the Joint Committee on Human Rights. Is a very distinguished lawyer, and we wanted to have that expertise at this hearing.
Distinguished lawyers are calling members of Parliament sinister.
Rude.
Well, rude. I'm not going to stop you asking your questions, but I just want to make it clear that Mr. Wagner is a very experienced and expert in the field of human rights law, and that's why we've got him here today.
Expert at what? Insulting people.
God's sake. Well, nobody's insulting anybody in this room, so let's be clear about that. And we're not making this personal. We're looking at the facts of what happened, and we're trying to get to the point where we understand decisions and why they were made. So perhaps if we do it on that level, James.
Mr. Smith.
Sorry, can I just respond to that? I didn't mean at all, and I said it wasn't personal. I just found that the idea that you question the head of a protest movement for bringing a loudspeaker, I think it's a sign of something really difficult and dangerous in our democracy, that we're sort of...
Use the word sinister, Mr. Wagner, nobody else
I thought the questioning was sinister. I'm sorry, I did think it was.
Mr. Smith, one of the concerns I have in respect to this hearing is that and this has been raised before, is we appear to be having a discussion regarding a set of circumstances where some of the people involved in this are not here. So you've given your take, you've accused people of being dishonest and various other things. There is no way of me testing that evidence here, because the police officers who were present, who arrested you, have not been invited before this committee, are not able to give their side of the story. So I don't really know what I can ask in respect to that, because as far as I can see, that from the information that we have, you came down here to protest, and the police officers appear to have taken a view in respect of, based upon intelligence and on respect of some of the items that were either close to you or in your possession and in the possession of the other people who were arrested, that they had legal grounds to arrest you. I mean, that's basically all we can establish, isn't it? You dispute that. They say they did have legal grounds, and that's that, isn't it? That's basically the height of what we can talk about here today. If we are going to get into the point where select committees of this House are turning themselves actually into courts, We're into a very difficult set of circumstances there.
Well, I don't think that's the case. I mean, you're more than welcome to invite the 50 members of the Strategic Tactical Support Group here to... Absolutely. Well, that's entirely up to the chair of the committee, but...
I apologise for interrupting you. Can I just make it clear that when we contacted the Metropolitan Police, we did ask, I think, James, you'd requested this, that we had officers who were on the front line that day who could come and give evidence, or not give evidence, explain what happened. And the Metropolitan Police took the decision that they would send Assistant Commissioner Twist. That was their decision. Then, so that's why we're in the position we are today, just so everyone's clear.
And I think it's perfectly reasonable as someone who was detained for 16 hours without any intent or motive even to commit any crime, to say quite clearly, and to express also the view of my solicitor, who said this quite clearly to the officers in the station and the pace officer, that this was an unlawful arrest and detention. I mean, the motive is also an important point, which I did point out to them, and which we pointed out to the officers we had liaison meetings with, because I was at pains to stress that we had no intention whatsoever of doing anything such as, and these specific things were talked about, locking on, throwing anything into the route, getting into the route, or anything else which would cause them any concern. And we were very clear that we did not want to cause the police any concern, which is one of the reasons why we were liaising with them. And I said that, aside from anything else, we do not have any motivation whatsoever to do that, because it would be an incredibly stupid thing for a anti-monarchist campaign to do, because I fully accept that we don't have a majority on side, and I fully accept that our job is to present both our case and ourselves as reasonable people with a reasonable message, and you will not necessarily do that disrupting the coronation. So, you know, I
think that the set of circumstances that were in play at the time, and I think that the police were put in a position where they were protecting and looking to protect the safety of hundreds of thousands of people, together with horses and other people involved in the coronation. And it is curious to me, Mr. Smith, that you never once mention your concern or the issue of the public protection of hundreds of thousands of people as an important factor in what's going through your intention when you're going there.
We had discussions about that with the police. We said that we did our own risk assessments. We took we took decisions in relation to what we were doing and how we were doing it. We had our own volunteer welfare officer recruited. We had other people specifically to manage and hold the large flags. We were very clear about our impact on the people around us. We have had protests in other cities where we have engaged with the people around us in good humour, and we have made it very clear that we're not protesting against them, but we are protesting against the monarchy. So, you know, it is...
Just going on from that, tell me what it is, specifically, in the Public Order Act that you disagree with, that you dispute, that you think is not needed in response to the concerns of the constituents I represent and all of my colleagues.
I think if there is a law that allows people to be rounded up without evidence and detained for 16...
Wrong.
It's not wrong, excuse me.
Well, 100% incorrect what you've just said.
100%. Well, you might want to talk to the young woman from Australia who was rounded up without evidence and ask her about that, because she spent hours in...
Do you know that? Listen, if there's a set of circumstances where... I was a criminal lawyer, Mr. Smith, for 17 years. I've dealt with, like Mr. Wagner, with many, many cases of unlawful arrest. You are creating the impression that this is some unique situation. This is a situation that it happens every single day throughout the country in every police force.
What, unlawful arrest?
Well, I think...
Absolutely. The circumstances...
Well, can I just...
Scotland, it doesn't.
Okay, one at a time, and I think if you want to respond to that, and then I'm going to take Mark Olongi. Yeah.
I mean, I can just reiterate, there was not a single piece of evidence of any intent or capacity to commit any crime when they detained us for searching. And they then released a statement saying we'd been arrested under conspiracy to cause a public nuisance, which was not correct. They then later re-arrested me for that in order to make my arrest record match the press statement. It had all the hallmarks of being predetermined. And as I said, it was said earlier by, I think... Mr. Twist, is it? That, you know, they tried to be as helpful as possible. That was absolutely the opposite of what they did now. Now, I have, as I said, done many other protests where they have been very helpful, where we have discussed things, what they could have done on that day, and this is an important point as a contrast. one officer could have come up and asked us who we were. They could have then spoken to the liaison officer. They could have, if they said, look, do you mind if we look in the van? We said, absolutely, of course, go for it. If they raised concerns about the straps, we would have explained, as we did, what they were for. We would have told them that they would have been put back in the van and the van was going back to North London, and we could have carried on our way. But instead they detained us, they confiscated the placards and then continued to disrupt and diminish the protest all the way through the day.
Right, OK, James,
I don't accept that for a second, and that's completely contradicted by the evidence of the police. And we are turning this hearing simply into giving you a platform to say things which there is no possibility whereby, and the evidential basis that we can challenge in this room, and therefore I don't know why.
Okay, well, we're not a court of law. We've just invited people to give their account of what happened. Evidence. We're not a court of law, James. Right, Mark Olongi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If I could first start with Ms Melvin and then perhaps Mr Smith. Can I also thank you for the work that you do and your colleagues? It does appear to be very unfortunate what happened to you. Would it be in your judgment that the police, given the extremely high stakes and the very high tension of the situation on the day, simply made a mistake, or do you believe there might have been some sort of malicious element to their actions?
I fully accept it was a challenging situation for the police. I was informed by the officer who arrested me that they were specifically looking for the Night Stars, and they had been told where we were going to be, and then we weren't there, so later told where we were in Soho Square, so then found us, which would suggest that there was some intelligence that they'd received that we were involved in something.
Do you think maybe the intelligence might be around the fact that giving out rape alarms, the fact that these devices can cause very high-pitched noises could have caused a sudden occurrence to happen amongst the horses that were parading, and therefore potentially an incredible amount of harm to people, and that perhaps the judgment by police officers on the day, being risk-based, had to take a view which was unenviable, and they thought that the stakes were just simply too high. In retrospect, it seemed like they made clearly perhaps the wrong judgment, but there wasn't any malicious intent in doing so.
So we do carry rape alarms, which are part of a larger anti-spiking kit. Neither myself or one of my colleagues have ever handed out a rape alarm. I think across the three of us, we had potentially 3-4 rape alarms on us over the three of us. So I believe in searching our bags and in talking to us, I'm not sure why we were then arrested and detained.
As I said, there's a potential of a mistake having taken place.
Yes.
But there was no malicious intent in doing so.
I can't comment. I wouldn't have thought so. I'd hope not.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Smith, you've made a big play today on the fact that you engaged a lot with the police, and I clearly commend you for doing so. But would you also accept that it is a well-known thing that protest groups of all sorts might describe an intent with a view to perhaps misleading, and therefore this is something that the policing authorities, again having to take a risk-based approach, have to consider whether that position is entirely correct. You have seen today that people came in wearing particular clothing. The intention was to sit behind witnesses and to simply observe proceedings, but actually what they did was completely different. So they themselves, and I'm not wanting you to compare you clearly to Just Stop Oil, but that policing authorities have to also take a view, a risk-based view, which is whatever is being said to them might not be entirely be the case, because there could be even an intent to mislead in order to achieve their outcomes.
Well, indeed, obviously, but I think that the point with us is that we had been speaking to them for 4 months, and they had made it abundantly clear that they had no concerns. Even on I think the Thursday or the Friday beforehand, they issued a statement because there was some concern around other statements that had been made about having low tolerance of protest, they issued another statement saying, or they were quoted in the Telegraph, I think it was, saying that they would engage with us and allow us to continue with our protest. And it's been pointed out by the police officers, and I think elsewhere, that they would also, it's not good enough to simply see someone in possession of something which may or may not be a lock-on device. They need evidence of or reasonable grounds for suspicion of intent, which they couldn't possibly have had because there was nothing in anything we had done, said or thought or communicated that would suggest such intent. And as I said, it's also about a proportion. As I've just described, they could have simply had a conversation with us. Now, their hostile tone from the moment they turned up made it very clear that they were not interested in any such discussions. I mean, they, as I said before, I immediately said, we have had these conversations. I named the superintendent we'd met in person. I named the liaison officer and attempted to phone her, and he twice stopped me from doing that, including grabbing my wrist and removing the phone from my hand. So there was no engagement at all. And as I understand it from the letter, I believe, and I think it was said before, that the arresting officer spoke to the bronze commander, and I also know that the bronze commander was engaged and briefed and all the rest of it. So yes, it may happen, but if we are going to have it so broad that we just say, well, these things may theoretically happen, therefore we can arrest you because you have something which may theoretically be used to lock on. I mean, I've turned up today with 5 lock-on devices on my person. My tie, my watch, my belt, and 2 shoelaces. Now, someone could have phoned up the Met and said, well, he's planning to lock himself to the chair when he's during the middle of the committee. And should I spend 16 hours in detention for that so-called intelligence and those so-called lock-on devices? I mean, there has to be quite a serious...
With respect, I'm sorry to interrupt because I'm very mindful of time. You can't really make such flippant comparisons, given, as I described just a few moments ago to Miss Melvin, that the events of the day were clearly extremely high stakes, extremely tense, for all sorts of different reasons, and that if a police officer is given reasonable doubt and suspicion that something perhaps untoward could happen in that particular context, which maybe on a different day with a different context might be interpreted differently, they perhaps had no choice but to take the actions they took.
I think the
Marco, I don't think we need to rehearse this again. I think there's obviously a clear...
But the response I received before about shoelaces, with greatest respect, Madam Chair, is a flippant response to a valid point I was making.
All I would say is repeat the fact that there were many, many things they could have done short of the heavy-handed arrest of me and my colleagues.
Right, Simon Fell.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to be incredibly brief because I'm very aware of time. I just want to get a couple of facts on the record. So, Mr. Smith, your dialogue with the Met ahead of the coronation, I'm just keen to understand sort of level of detail you got into them over your plans. So, for instance, did you tell them that there would be straps in the back of the van, that there might be combination locks in there, that you'd be driving I'm assuming a transit van into central London and unloading on the day? Was that all in that dialogue?
Well, I think some of the small minutiae of the logistics might have not been communicated to them because we'd already established a pretty good relationship and they knew that we were going to be transporting 600. We told them 600 placards would be transported, so I don't know whether it needed to be spelt out that they'd need a van for that. But and the luggage strap thing was very late in the day because we only had delivery of the placards very late in the day, and we realised that to keep them on the trolleys we would need to strap them on. I mean, they did say to us, and the other police forces have said to us that the reason why they like this dialogue is so they don't have any surprises on the day. But it shouldn't be that difficult to simply engage on the day and continue that dialogue. People talk about short time frames. There was 4 hours between us turning up and being arrested and the procession. We were well away from the procession route. It would have been very easy to have a continued dialogue to speak again to the liaison team, and then if they needed to, just take the straps off us.
And look, I appreciate that, but we were all here as they were setting up the days before, and we saw the amount of effort going into clearing paths and making sure everything was prepared in advance. And what I'm trying to understand is, were the Met Police expecting a transit van to drive into central London and start unloading on the morning or not? Was that the sort of conversation you were having with them?
I believe so, yeah. But I mean, it wasn't in the controlled area. There were other vans on the same street as well as taxis. So it was within the normal sort of public access area where the van was. And they certainly knew that we would be turning up with 600 placards. So whether I needed to sort of tell them the nature of the van that would be required for that, I can't really recall. But I think that they would have known that we would have been descending on the square in good order with quite early on. We did tell them we would be there at 6 a.m. We were quite clear about what equipment we would be bringing down there. And as I said, the straps were there to minimise disruption and disorder so that they would stay on the trolley and we could move them as quickly as possible.
Would you be prepared to share correspondence you have with the Met in advance of this?
Yes, I've got emails from between myself and the liaison officer. I don't see any particular reason why you shouldn't see them.
Thank you very much. And finally, Miss Melvin, just head of obviously the incident that happened to you, did you have any dialogue with the Met Police around the incoming legislation, what it might mean for you and your operations, and how you might need to engage with them in the future?
Not directly, no, but I'm aware that members of Westminster City Council were in regular dialogue with the Met Police, and particularly around in the lead up to the coronation events as well, and they weren't made aware of any suggestion that we might be involved in any sort of plots to disrupt the coronation.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Could I just ask one question about the letter of the 27th of April, which was sent setting out the incoming legislation? Have you ever received a letter like that before, setting out changes? Yeah, sorry.
No, never. I mean, I was quite staggered. I mean, to me, and I know the officers before said that it's not unusual, but we've never had any kind of communication from the Home Office at all. And it struck me as the Home Office interceding into a relationship between us and the police. It seemed a very odd and inappropriate thing to do. If they wanted the police to brief us on such things, they could have done that through the liaison officers. So it was, as I was on record, it seemed, it certainly gave the impression of being intimidatory. I mean, obviously that's an unproven allegation, but that's certainly how it felt.
Adam, have you ever come across this before, that the Home Office is writing out to protest groups, setting out changes in the law?
No, I don't think. I've got a little bell in my head about what was going on during COVID, that there may have been some sort of communication, but I've not seen it in sort of general, there is a new law. But this was quite unusual because it was a major new law that came into effect really hours before the events, so it was an unusual situation.
Right. Okay. Joanna Cherry and then Tim Lawton.
Yeah, I just wanted Adam to ask you about this notion that disruptive protest is in itself criminal. Would the criminalisation of protest, merely because it's disruptive, be in line with the state's duties to respect the rights that we have under Article 10 and Article 11 of the ECHR to freedom of expression and freedom of assembly? And if not, why not?
Well, I mean, as Mr. Twist rightly said, the right to freedom of expression is a qualified right, so it can be limited if there is a legitimate aim. The aim could be protecting public safety, could be various other things. So it is a qualified right. So you can do things like stop people protesting on roads. We've had a law against that obstruction of the highway for a long time. But what it really depends on is what you mean by disruption. And if the threshold for disruption is set very low, and I think my concern about the Police Act is that it's set at a level which includes very noisy protests, and that really would include any protest, potentially any successful protest, apart from a silent protest. I think we'll find out if the courts in the UK and potentially in Strasbourg consider that to be an undue restriction. A lot will be to do with that. So the restriction can't be in the abstract. It will have to be in actually the way it's enforced. So what you'll see is individual cases going to potentially to the courts and then to potentially to Strasbourg, to the European Court of Human Rights, to decide where the limits of the correct limits of the legislation are. So I mean, I don't know, but the balance is concerning to me.
Thank you.
Can I just ask Mr. Wagner, and I'll try not to be sinister.
Yesterday.
We've only concentrated on the Republic protesters. Do you think that those who were arrested from Just Stop Oil were treated unfairly?
I don't know the individual facts of those cases at all. I mean, and it's not for me to say whether it was fair or not. It's just a question of whether it's lawful, and I just don't know.
Do you think that they should have a right to be able to do go-slow demonstrations in front of traffic?
I mean, it depends on the circumstances. So there is case law in the European Court of Human Rights about go-slow demonstrations, where there was a case, I think, possibly in Lithuania, where there were farmers' unions who were driving tractors along roads and blocking traffic. And I think that was found, criminal offence was found to be unlawful, criminal conviction.
They could have a case for a go-slow demonstration that wouldn't break.
I mean, potentially. And there's been quite a lot before the new go-slow regulations. There's been injunctions trying to prevent people going slow walking on roads.
If a group of Just Stop Oil protesters had jumped out in front of the Royal Coach on the Coronation Day and then did a go slow in front of the coach, would that have been legitimate or not?
I mean, I can't answer for legitimacy, but it probably wouldn't have been lawful. Potentially wouldn't have been lawful because they would have been obstructing the highway without a reasonable excuse.
What you've just said is there was a difference of magnitude in the event of the coronation when that would not be legitimate, and potentially Just Stop Oil protesters doing what they've been doing again this morning that might indeed be legitimate. So the coronation was an altogether different event, wasn't it?
I don't think it was a different event, particularly.
You've just admitted that.
I don't know if any of those events, whether on Westminster Bridge or blocking the coronation, would be lawful or not. It depends on the facts.
The coronation was of such a magnitude, effectively, that differential policing of it would be justified. That's correct, isn't it?
Well, if that was what you took from it, I don't agree. And I think that's the way the Metropolitan Police handled it. And that's what you heard from Mr. Twist. That's what you heard from the Commissioner, saying this was a once-in-a-lifetime event, all of that. But it's also, I mean, the flip side of that is it's a once-in-a-lifetime political event to protest at. So I don't know whether that stacks up. So the honest answer is every event should be policed, particularly to that event with its own factors, but there's no reason in principle why the coronation will be different to Westminster Bridge.
Well, that's an interesting point to end on. So can I thank all three of you, Graham, Adam and Suzie. I think it's been, you've been asked some quite challenging questions, but I think it's, and legitimate, I'm not saying they're not legitimate, but they've been challenging. But we very much appreciate, particularly Graham and Suzie, being able to come and talk to us today and explain what happened. We very much appreciate that. And can I wish you all well. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Chair.